Good afternoon. Please find your seats. My name is Stephen Long, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the third annual Veritas Conference, even though it says second. It's really our third. It's my pleasure this afternoon to say just a little bit about our conference, to introduce this year's themes, and to welcome our first keynote speaker. Living wisely in reality requires us to grasp reality as it is. As ethicist Oliver O'Donovan reminds his readers, we have to reckon not only with the fact that there is a world, but with what that world is like, where it has come from, where it is going, and how it holds together. These are not questions that answer themselves. Much moral thought turns on how the various elements that constitute the world are properly conceived and described. For example, is human nature a playground of selfish genes or the Lord of creation? Is the human embryo a child or a mere piece of tissue? Is our behavior conditioned or is it chosen? Such descriptive questions are the stuff of moral debate. They determine all our practical attitudes. O'Donovan's remarks can be taken, I think, as the fundamental justification for having an annual Veritas Conference here at Providence College. We aim to address topics, invite speakers, foster conversations that will aid students, academics, and all those in our region, especially those who profess to be Christian, in describing and understanding our contemporary world. That is, understanding where it has come from, where it is going, how it holds together. Our topic this year is progress. Relative to earlier epochs in human history, we live in a time of material abundance. We enjoy a technological mastery over nature of which earlier generations could only dream. Civil and voting rights have been extended to more members of developed Western societies than ever before. And we appear to command a growing self-determination even over our own biological nature, due to advances in gene and medical technologies. In other words, we seem to enjoy the fruits of something commonly called progress. But what actually counts as genuine progress? By what standards can we evaluate the phenomena of progress? How might advancing progress take on a life of its own that may prove antithetical to genuine human flourishing? What resources does the Christian tradition, and especially for PC, the Catholic and Dominican tradition, offer for thinking about and guiding our pursuit of progress? Questions such as these, prompting description of reality, as well as prescriptive recommendations about how to live wisely in reality, will be the substance of our weekend together. So it's my pleasure to welcome you. Please listen attentively, think up questions, stay around for a fellowship afterwards. We look forward to the pleasure of your company. And now it's also my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Mary Harrington. Mary is a public intellectual, contributing editor at UnHerd. In her first book, Feminism Against Progress, came out just last year, she asks, can you be a feminist if you don't believe in progress? She writes a Substack, Reactionary Feminist, and is present on Twitter, posting to many stimulating essays. So please join me in welcoming her to our campus.
Thank you all so much for having me, and thank you to Stephen and everybody else for hosting me. It's a privilege to be here and to open this meeting, a real privilege. I'm not going to talk just about progress, but specifically about America and progress. As a foreigner here, a visitor from England and a guest, this is risky. I don't want to offend anybody. I really don't. But our purpose here this weekend is to explore the themes of progress and a truly human future. In that context, I'm going to take the risk of speaking as a foreigner about a particular relation to progress that is, in my observation, most pronounced here in America. I want to explore the relation of this distinctive impulse, which I see as a spiritual impulse, to a technologizing one, to master the material world. And I want to suggest that in this combination, a high and very beautiful aspiration stands so close to a literally anti-human one. Is it okay with this echo? That feels really scary to me when it does that. Is that better for you? Okay. All right. Okay, I'll just get used to it. It's fine. It'll be fine. Okay. I want to say in this combination, a high and beautiful aspiration is so close to a literally anti-human one as to be almost indistinguishable. And my aim here, in these remarks, is to offer some reflections on telling them apart. A way we might open our eyes differently and see the world and ourselves not as fallen, failed, and corrupted copies in need of spiritualization through technology, but a realm revealed as always alive, always created, and always filled with the light of God. First, though, we need to uncover some of the theological frameworks smuggled into the word progress. Because talk about progress is never just about incremental improvements. Rather, it's a spiritual narrative that's taken on supposedly secular coloring without ever really losing its theological character. This idea of progress is somehow everywhere all the time. It seems to be in the air, in books, movies, stories. We have to move forward. We can't go backwards. The starting premise for my book, Feminism Against Progress, was a story of losing my faith. I don't believe this version of progress is a thing. I don't mean nothing ever gets better, nor do I mean I think everything is somehow getting worse. Nor, obviously, do I mean nothing ever changes. I mean, clearly we don't live in the same world as, say, Roman Britain. But this notion of progress tends to claim we don't need a substantive vision of the good, one, and also to claim that we're heading from somewhere to somewhere. History is a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Usually, though not always, this comes with an assumption that the to is better than the from. But you're still using the same framework if you run it in reverse and say things are getting worse, that the from is worse than the to. Anyway, it's still the same framework. It's a long story how I got there, but I came to feel that no, it's not self-evident that in sum, the world now is better in any absolute sense than that of, say, Roman Britain. It's different, but how can we call it definitively better? If you want to prove that, you have to define your terms. So you can point to things which are definitely better now, if Stephen's mentioned a few of them already. Other things are surely worse. There's no way to evaluate the trade-offs, except by defining on what terms you think we're progressing, and you have to do so narrowly enough to exclude the things that have got worse, but that you think don't matter. And that's a circular definition that assumes the truth of what it set out to prove, as the lawyers call it, begging the question. The only other way to evaluate the claim would be divine omniscience, so knowing literally everything about everything. And that gives us a clue to what's actually going on here, which is to say, a continuation of theology by other means. So let's bracket the truth, or otherwise, of progress. Let's stop thinking about it as a fact and explore its structure as a belief, as a framework for thinking about the world. To be progressing, we have to be going somewhere, usually somewhere better. The ultimate endpoint, the ultimate somewhere, is also, therefore, logically the ultimate better. That is, the point at which everything that's wrong with the world has been resolved. There are a lot of theologians and other people of faith in this audience, intimidatingly high proportion. I'm not a theologian, so I'm probably stating the obvious here, but if this is all sounding familiar, that's because it is. History, in this moralized sense, has a heavily Christian flavor. Greek and Roman mythologies, for example, had creation stories, but no end times. There was no to, there was only a from. Norse and Hindu mythologies, for example, have end times, but the story is cyclical. You just go back to the beginning again. The structure of progress is a version of Christian eschatology, with the transcendent bits edited out or sanded flat or otherwise disguised. This is not an original observation at all. The social critic Christopher Lasch described progress as a secularized version of the Christian belief in providence. So this is a fitting city for this discussion. Anyway, in this white-labeled form, progress tells us we're fine without a divine creation story. We don't need a substantive vision of the good. We don't need faith in God, the soul, or the afterlife. All that stuff about the end of days? Progress strips out the overtly spiritual bits and the explicit moral narrative, but it keeps the structure, the from and the to, and it keeps the expectation, now mostly content-free and ungrounded, that the endpoint will fix everything that's wrong with the world. As we'll see, this pared-down version of Christian eschatology hides another premise, with very important implications for our conversation this weekend. That is, a set of assumptions about the how of progress, the methods at our disposal for bringing it about. First, though, I want to dwell on what's distinctively American, as I see it, about this theology of progress. I'll say first up that I speak from a place of love. I visit America a lot, and I sincerely love your country in all its hugeness and all its strangeness. I speak also, as a Brit, from a place of close cultural kinship. Culturally speaking, Brits and Americans overlap, and yet differ. We are, as George Bernard Shaw put it, divided by a common language. The historical relation between Brits and Americans is ambivalent in some respects, of course. All the Disney villains still have English accents. What's with that? And yet, Brits and Americans are cultural cousins. The impulse I'm speaking about today was English before it was American. It came to America with the early English colonists. But modern America has, at a fundamental level, a very different orientation to reality to that of the modern English, and especially to what could be. The first time I visited the USA was about 20 years ago, 20-some. I landed in New England. I found it so similar, I still do, to the England I'd just left. It was like being in a bizarre dream where everything's the same but kind of different. Then I got on a Greyhound bus and headed south and found myself in a totally different world. I rode the Greyhound bus network coast to coast. I'll spare you the travelogue, except to say it was wild. I came away with 3 abiding memories. A love of breakfast burritos, 1. A deep, deep fear of gas station coffee, 2. And a powerful sense of how abundant America's resources are of raw spiritual wealth. It's common here, in this country, especially among conservatives, to hear the opposite, that America is spiritually impoverished, in the grip of decadence, materialism, some other variant of moral crisis and collapse. That was not my impression on the Greyhound bus 2 decades ago. It's not my impression now. Quite the opposite, in fact. Let me explain what I mean. America is extraordinarily rich in raw resources of faith, in a way that those born in this country sometimes find difficult to see, but which is very clear as a foreigner. America is what it is today partly thanks to the crude oil that gushed and still gushes from the ground. But raw faith also springs in this country, seemingly as freely as oil. I'm not talking about organized religious communities, though America, of course, has plenty of these. That's refined faith. The same relation to the raw kind as petrol to crude oil. You all are better placed than I am to speak to the health or otherwise of these communities. I'm talking about raw faith, the capacity to believe and to move mountains on the basis of faith. This is a kind of spiritual wealth that erupts wherever and whenever and wherever Americans have a big idea. This abundant and free-flowing wealth of raw faith is what powers the hidden eschatology of progress. What's especially important, though, is an equally culturally specific how. When you have a big idea, a high vision, a grand picture of what could be, that seems powerfully true, what happens next? The answer can vary across cultures. One culture might say only certain types of people can have grand visions, or the response might be to withdraw from the world and contemplate. Here, though, in the USA, the more usual answer is believe hard enough and you can make it happen. You don't need to look very far in secular American culture, which propagates all over the world, so I meet plenty of it as well, to find this sentiment. Cinderella sings it in the 1950 Disney movie. I'm not going to sing the tune because I'm just not. No matter how your heart is grieving, if you keep on believing, the dream that you wish will come true. I'm sure you've all seen the movie. I can think of countless other instances, from the prosperity gospel to the California-coded practice of manifestation. That is, deliberately cultivating a mindset to transform reality in line with your wishes. As a foreigner who loves this country, I can tell you this is distinctively, unmistakably American. An impulse not just to believe and hope, but to manifest, to make it happen. In this, again, Brits and Americans are cousins. Britain was the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, thanks to a certain empiricism, and practicality, and will to material mastery. These things are, or were, common to both English and American cultures. But again, perhaps for historical reasons, in America this takes on a visionary dimension, which is very different to English pragmatism. If I were to speculate, I might suggest that the moment of cleavage lies back in the 17th century. In England at that time, we resolved our religious divisions after a fashion via a set of pragmatic political and religious compromises. The Restoration after Cromwell and so on. There were a great many Protestants for whom this was too grubby. A lot of these crossed the Atlantic to realize their vision on what seemed then a pristine, blank territorial slate. They brought with them English pragmatism and also spiritual vision. The name of this city, Providence, carries something of their legacy. It's a real place in the real world. It's named for a sense that the hand of God is everywhere. We're some centuries on from that now. America, though, still makes sense to me, mostly within this frame. A baseline conviction that we can focus on the real world because the hand of God is everywhere. In more secular terms, that dreams come true precisely because it's possible to dream and believe before the dream is made manifest, and then the dream will be made manifest. On my Greyhound bus adventure 20 years ago, at one point I remember passing through some little town in the American interior whose name escapes me now. It was muggy. There was a white-painted wooden church with one of those signs out front with a Bible quote in movable letters. It said, "Blessed is he who believes without a sign." At the time, I thought it was funny to put up a sign about believing without a sign. But it stuck in my mind because it captures one of the ways America really is blessed, with this raw abundance of faith, a wellspring of ability to believe without a sign. I'm sure you all know the reference, but to recap, the Gospel of John tells the story of the disciple Thomas, who didn't believe those who recounted having seen and touched the risen Christ. Then, when he did see Jesus and touched the wounds in his hands and his side, he was overjoyed. John records Jesus telling him, "Thomas, because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed. Blessed are they that have not seen and yet have believed." This is the moment honored by that sign outside the church, those who believe without having seen. This story has insights for us today as regards the temptations that come with and emanate from believing without a sign, especially if the first thing you want to do with that belief is to manifest the sign. To get a better handle on this, we need to think a bit more about dreams that come true. The history of modernity, then, to recap, is the history of Britain and America. The American historian Carl Becker recounts how this modern idea of progress is Christian, but specifically an iteration of Christian thought since the Enlightenment, particularly with Newton and Locke, who I believe Angela will have some remarks on tomorrow. Becker describes how these new ideas, and I quote, seemed to make man the product of an environment that could be modified and indefinitely perfected with the increase of scientific knowledge. I want to focus here on the epistemological two-step that underlies this dream of perfection through engineering. If modernity was nursed in Britain and carried to America with the Puritans, it's also been the crucible of grand revolutionary visions elsewhere. Visions the philosopher Eric Voegelin described as a yearning to immanentize the Eschaton. That is, to manifest in the here and now in history a vision of perfected humanity that was once understood spiritually and as something we can realize only with God's help. In his 1952 The New Science of Politics, Voegelin drew a connection between the 20th century utopian projects of fascism and communism and the Gnostic yearning for a world perfected, no longer fallen and corrupted. Plenty of other writers and thinkers since Voegelin, in America and elsewhere, have critiqued the totalitarian 20th century ideologies and their failure to manifest heaven on earth. It's a utopianism that shades very swiftly into tyranny, as we've seen, and into horrific means justified by idealistic ends. The great conservative American thinker William F. Buckley made resisting this kind of utopianism into a rallying cry for the 60s and 70s young Americans for freedom. Don't immanentize the eschaton. Here's the thing, though. Immanentizing the eschaton is the whole point of the American project. This is just more difficult to see, because this project has, historically, been better at disguising its ideological nature. The disciple Thomas was an empiricist, in a way perhaps both Brits and Americans can relate to. He wanted to see for himself. But that sign outside a church left me with the sense that if there's a difference between Brits and Americans, it lies in a willingness to believe without a sign. What's characteristically American is when you then set out to make the sign. That's the two-step. First, believing without a sign, then setting out to manifest it, using every resource at our disposal of both faith and ingenuity. Within this vision of progress, Thomas need not believe without a sign, or not for long. We can make it happen. Then we'll have the sign. This cocktail of high idealism, powered by boundless resources of faith and underwritten by material pragmatism, is America's distinctive gift. This two-step dance of faith and material ingenuity underlies the astonishing wealth of real-world innovation that wells up wherever you go in this country. It's also America's most profound temptation. And this is due to the way this mindset transforms our relation to the world around us. In The Question Concerning Technology, written 1950, I believe, Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, characterizes the essence of technology not as a set of techniques or tools, but as a mindset, which he calls Gestell, usually translated as enframing. Within this mindset, we no longer encounter the world in its full being, as it is, Heidegger argues. Instead, our relation to whatever we encounter is through what he calls a challenging forth of those aspects of that thing that may be useful to us as resources. Now, if your outlook combines high idealism and the will to manifest your ideals, you need to see the world in these terms. How else do you realize a vision, in reality, in history, other than by using what you have? In this sense, enframing, as Heidegger describes it, is the mirror and complement to America's bubbling reserves of raw faith, also those of oil, which is perhaps the definitive fusion of material and spiritual resources in this sense. In this sense, too, enframing is the how of progress, as Becker describes it, as making man the product of an environment that could be modified and indefinitely perfected with the increase of scientific knowledge. It's how we do the modifying and the perfecting. At its heart, always, however covertly, some version of the eschaton to be made imminent in the here and now. It's more usual to critique these themes from an ecological perspective. The negative consequences of this mindset, the enframing mindset, are most visible within ecological frame. For instance, in the literal extraction of resources, to provide raw materials so we can modify and indefinitely perfect something or other with the increase of scientific knowledge. Appalachian mountains scooped out like grapefruit for the coal they contain. Bleached coral reefs. I'm sure you can think of more examples. Or from a left-wing perspective, when anti-capitalists talk about imperialism, colonialism, and whiteness even. The heart of what they're pointing to is this enframing, this extractive, this instrumentalizing perspective. I note these not because I want to go down the climate change or the anti-capitalist rabbit holes, but rather to highlight that what should already be clear, which is that progress, understood in this way, as a force of collective innovation, is both apparently neutral and inescapably political in its consequences. There are ecological trade-offs. There are economic winners and losers. How do we manage these? Politics is messy. Can we not innovate our way out of these as well? It's a logical extension of the impulse buried in the urge to innovate, to improve, to perfect. The idea then develops. Now, it's not just material conditions, but human societies that might be perfected. The dream, that we might attain a kind of political universality that transcends conflict. At scale, in political terms, the corollary of this mindset is what Carl Schmitt calls the spirit of technicity. In his 1920 essay, Roman Catholicism and Political Form, Schmitt contrasts the power of the Catholic Church to represent God made man in this world with what he calls the spirit of technicity, or economical technical thinking. Today we'd call this managerialism. For Schmitt, this is a mode of organization that rejects representation for technocracy and aspires to a kind of political universality that's transcended friend and enemy. As Schmitt later argues in The Age of Neutralizations and Depoliticizations, part of the role of a sovereign power is to establish peace by creating a space within which a plurality of interests in the community can be negotiated. And one effect of the urge to apply both idealism and ingenuity to perfecting life on Earth in history is a push to extend this neutral space to encompass everyone. That is, to shift from a political to a technical mode of government that encompasses the whole world, to technologize away all the causes of conflict. This impulse takes a different approach to fascism and to communism, but in its way, it's every bit as utopian. One of its grandest post-war manifestations is the rules-based international order. This has been an American project since its inception under Woodrow Wilson. Within it, the aim was always the technologization of the political. The European Union is a kind of copy of the same principle. Moving international relations from the messy and political business of competing national interests and competing geographic groups and interests to a supranational, managerial, neutral one that stands above friend and enemy, to create a neutral space in which a plurality of interests can be managed. Recent headlines cast some doubt as to how completely effective this has been. But for us, the important point is this. It's not a coincidence that this institutional structure emanated from America. The American empire is coextensive with this rules-based international order, Pax Americana. Without American hard power, it would be gone. It's fashionable on both far left and far right nowadays to accuse this empire of cynical self-interest in propagating Pax Americana. I don't think this is a fair assessment of the sincere impulse at work. Sure, there have been upsides for America, but I think the impulse came first, to bring about an end to war, by bringing about an end to the political. If this vision of a perfect system that will free us from human conflict and frailty sounds familiar, that's because it is. Hi, Eschaton. So, let's recall Vogelin for a moment. He critiqued the Gnostic idealism that lies beneath fascist and communist ideologies. I would like to suggest, gently and with love, that this utopianism is not found only over there and back then with those people and their ideologies, but rather that it resides within the spirit of technicity itself. A spirit of idealism plus engineering that animated these 20th century ideologies and that also powers a great deal of the utopian vigor in this country. What's important here is to grasp that we're not talking about a set of technologies employed in service to an ideology. It's much more that the technologies themselves are the ideology. The Chinese Communist Party official and political thinker Wang Huning visited the United States in the 1990s. Afterwards, he wrote America Against America, a study of the United States. And in this, he observed that the American order is so individualist that the only power capable of governing it is technology. To a great degree, he says, American society is managed by a technological order. Man is more obedient to the technological than he is to the political. So now the rubber hits the road. Let's recap. I've argued that progress represents a secularized Christian eschatology. It promises the power to immanentize the eschaton. It promises that we can and should first believe without a sign, then apply every resource of our ingenuity and the unframed world around us to manifesting that sign. And in this way, we can perfect not just the material realm, but also human society. In practice, when you try this, it's not an event, but a process. Because your utopia never actually arrives. It's always just around the corner. So you end up with an ongoing series of neutralizations and depoliticizations, technologizing away every flaw. And behind each of these lies the desire to realize heaven on earth. And the means of reaching for this is the spirit of technicity. As Wang Huning suggests, this is now the ideology, which is to say the religious framework, that orders America at scale, including internationally. A utopian ideology that conceals its ideological nature and its utopianism. So, having unpacked the ideal, let's look at its shadow, which stands so close to the ideal, they're almost impossible to tell apart. My way into all of this in my own work was reflecting on the problem of progress from a feminist standpoint. Perhaps the defining transformation of the 20th century was the extension of this order in the name of feminism to our own bodies. This is now well established. The World Economic Forum today calls it the Fourth Industrial Revolution, a new wave of innovation that fuses technology with life itself. The futurist Yuval Noah Harari characterizes this as the moment when the product of industrialization is no longer goods or services, but humans ourselves. As I set out in Feminism Against Progress, we're half a century into this revolution, which began with a technology now so widespread as to be largely invisible, the pill. The pill expresses the same utopian impulse as other technologies. It immanentizes the eschaton in this sense. It identifies an aspect of the human condition that it frames as imperfect. In this case, the constraints imposed on women by our reproductive biology. Only women get pregnant. Prior to the sexual revolution, this was managed socially, and humans have historically developed a great many culturally specific ways to slice the dilemma. But what all these had in common was that they were inescapably social. Rules, norms, taboos, and so on. Cognate with what Schmitt calls the domain of the political. The pill sets out to fix this problem, using all the technological resources at our disposal, to neutralize and to depoliticize. Previously, if I risked conceiving a child, everyone in my community had a stake in what I did and with whom. Post-pill, this was no longer anyone's business, except my own. That's the theory, anyway. So it proposes the same change within women's bodies and for couples as managerialism proposes for social relations, or the rules-based international order proposes for international affairs. To replace an inescapably political and moral mode of managing sex asymmetry with a neutral, post-political, technological one. Take this pill and you won't need sexual mores anymore. It's all just personal choice. We're back at the eschaton. Others have set out to evaluate the benefits and trade-offs of that transformation. For a positive treatment, there's pretty much the entirety of second-wave feminism. For a critical treatment, some of you may know Mary Eberstadt's work on Adam and Eve after the pill. We know this had a revolutionary impact on sexual mores. That's not what I want to discuss today, so much as its revolutionary impact on our medical paradigm and on our relation to what the human organism is or could be. Up to the pill, the practice of modern medicine, the practice of medicine for centuries, millennia even, was predicated on a shared understanding of normal human health. What I mean by this is that in order to have the concept sick, you need a normative picture of what healthy looks like. Then, when you visit the doctor, you're doing so because you need him or her to help restore you towards that picture of normative health. The pill does something different. It doesn't fix something that's broken with the aim of restoring normal health. It breaks normal health, specifically normal, healthy female fertility, and it does so in the name of individual freedom. It's impossible to overstate how radical a shift this was in the medical paradigm, and still is. Up to that point, medical progress stayed ordered to a shared normative framework of the human organism. After the pill, medical progress was unmoored from normal human physiology, in fact, often explicitly at war with it, as we'll see. That is, this transformation of the medical paradigm opened the door for a great many more such interventions, because there was another revolutionary paradigm shift hidden behind this again. Once you cut human physiology free from a shared understanding of normal health and order it to progress instead, which is to say this revolutionary combination of ideals plus engineering. This means, in effect, that progressive medicine has declared war on human nature. Arguably, we've been conducting a version of this war ever since we set about trying to technologize social relations, which is to say from close to the start of modernity. But with the fourth industrial revolution, this is extended to every aspect of our organismic nature. Within this framework, we're no longer created in the image of God. We're not created at all. We create ourselves. We're realized as people to the extent that we can perfect ourselves via technology. To take one example of this outlook, papers and clinical websites discussing gender-affirming medical procedures will speak of embodiment goals. That is, ideals plus engineering. Now, material givens have no value in and of themselves. We advance spiritually and morally to the extent that we can engineer material reality, including our own physiology, in line with our ideals. In the book, I called this meat-Lego Gnosticism. We can understand it as trying to realize heaven on earth, to immanentize the eschaton, and doing so by treating our bodies like Legos made of meat. So what happens when the human person becomes both site of and target for technological progress? What fallen elements of the human person could use an upgrade? There is no theoretical upper limit. We started by technologizing away the unfair asymmetry of pregnancy risk. This is now on its way to encompassing the entirety of our organismic human nature. That is, every normative trait, attribute, or limit we might previously have understood as given. What began with the injustice, quote unquote, of sex asymmetry has fanned out to technologizing fertility more generally, and in the same name of freedom and of progress. We can buy and sell large and small gametes. We can freeze eggs. We can create, store, implant, and sometimes destroy human embryos. We can subcontract gestation. Researchers are experimenting with artificial wombs. Elsewhere, others experiment with growing human eggs from other tissue cultures. Others again dream of gene editing, selecting embryos for specific traits, of in vitro gametogenesis, enabling the creation and recreation of multiple generations of human eggs in vitro, with the aim of enhancing specific genetic traits. It is in so many ways a continuation of the original American project. It brings the full force of English pragmatism to bear on the high spiritual vision of transcendent human perfection, and it sets out to manifest it in history. Of course, today, most of the time, people don't talk about the eschaton, but in a sense they talk about nothing else. In Silicon Valley, for instance, it's called the singularity, the moment when mankind will fuse irreversibly with our machines and become something altogether new. We could situate this in the future, as Ray Kurzweil does. We could situate it in 2007, when the iPhone came out and the internet came alive. Or we could situate it in the 1960s, when the pill was legalized and women were suddenly people to the extent that we'd corrected our deficiencies with technology. The point is that the perfection we've been promised is still always just around the corner. Now the promise is that brain-machine interfaces will be the thing that enables us to overcome our fallen nature. Or maybe it'll be the metaverse. Maybe that will be what finally allows us to see. So what are we to make of, or in, this empire of progress? I hope I've shown how its engine is idealism plus ingenuity, creating the sign we already believed in. How should we respond to the point we're at now, where we're pursuing our own salvation through engineering our own physiology? It's relatively easy to make the case to an unusually Christian audience, I would say, that maybe we shouldn't do this. Maybe we shouldn't do this. Among people who take as read our createdness, self-creation is obviously one, not possible, and two, wildly hubristic, not to mention three, maybe blasphemous as well. The hard problem is making the same case to people for whom Imago Dei means nothing. So how do we explain to someone who's closed their eyes to our createdness why we shouldn't try and create ourselves? Why shouldn't we use technology to make ourselves better? This is the case made, for example, by the organizers of the Enhanced Games, a proposed competitive games that actively encourages doping and human self-engineering in the interests of pushing the human organism to new experimental limits. For its proponents, according to the website, science is real and has an important place in supporting human flourishing. I'll come back to human flourishing relative to what and ordered to what. This is kind of the point. Many of the most vigorous proponents of technologizing ourselves now come from the right. This is not a left-wing project, even sometimes with a Christian gloss. A couple of years ago, I interviewed the tech founder and philanthropist Peter Thiel. Thiel is one of the funders for the Enhanced Games. In his view, there is no biblical basis for the idea of human nature, he told me. He views this as a classical rather than a Christian concept. And he told me that he thinks a Christian critique of transhumanism should not be that we shouldn't do it, but that it isn't radical enough. Because it's only because transhumanism, as he put it, is only seeking to transform our bodies and not our souls. That is, we have a duty to use technology to engineer ourselves to be better, to embrace the salvific potential of technologizing ourselves, to immanentize our post-apocalyptic perfected human nature within history. In response to this, these people are winning, I can tell you. These people are winning. It's not enough to just talk about God or creation or Imago Dei. That might work here, but as a journalist, I can tell you, the audience for theological language is pretty limited in the wider world. Our createdness may be self-evident to you, but to many it really isn't. And yet, it's by no means just Christians who intuit that something doesn't add up in this promise of salvation through biotech. Doubting Thomas has been my guide so far in this story. An apt guide as our conference falls during the season of Easter. The story of what happened after the resurrection is eerie and powerful. And whenever I read those passages, I'm struck again by the sense of a world both unchanged and yet utterly transformed, with the disciples' effort to grapple with a world that was material, but also spiritualized in a new way, in the light of the resurrection, and the tangible mystery and the tangible fact of this right in front of them, close enough to touch for Thomas. But I also think Thomas has a clue for us as to the way forward. I feel a measure of kinship with his stubborn empiricism and his longing to see. But, and this is important, Thomas did not create the sign he needed to see. The resurrection had already happened when he touched Jesus. We were already saved when Thomas saw. We aren't as lucky as Thomas. We don't get to touch. but we can see if we open our eyes. For the age of neutralizations and depoliticizations is always just round the corner and always needs another tech fix. This never actually results in an engineered salvation. The Industrial Revolution did not technologize away want. The rules-based international order has not technologized away international conflict. Managerialism has not technologized away inequality, inefficiency, corruption, and the myriad other very human ills that plague our social order. The pill has not technologized away sex dimorphism. Commercial surrogacy has not technologized away the reality that every child has a mother and father. And what's becoming increasingly clear, as we step further into technologizing ourselves, is that the means at our disposal to realize heaven on earth, the spirit of technicity, requires us to make an enemy of our own nature, which is the foundation and expression of our being, and hence part of what impels us to this project in the first place. Every effort to perfect our own nature through technology requires us to wage war on that nature, and every time we do this, in an effort to see, it carries us further from ourselves, and hence from being able to understand what we're seeing. Every effort to immanentize the Eschaton in these ways fails on its own terms. So, for example, the end of our experiment with abolishing reproductive dimorphism will be accepting that men and women exist. The end of our experiment with neutralization will be, in fact I'd argue already is, accepting that the political cannot be banished from our social order. Engineering ourselves will go the same way. The end of experiments with human enhancement, experiments that we probably can't prevent from occurring, will be understanding why normal is the way it is. Perhaps we'll accidentally engineer away our ability to engineer, who knows? But it will end with our deeper realism about our own nature. This is cold comfort, as I suspect we're going to have to learn the hard way. But in this somewhat bleak picture, the thing to keep our eyes on is the persistence of our created nature. Something flawed, but also transcendently, stubbornly real and true, including the fact that we can't engineer it away. From a secular perspective, we might say our evolved nature. From a Christian perspective, we might say created in God's image. I think these are kind of the same picture. But the additional insight the Christian perspective has to offer is in making sense of the fact that we can't, in fact, perfect our nature on our own. If this seems depressing, we can remember what Thomas discovered, that the miracle had already happened. That is, instead of trying to attain salvation through engineering, we can take comfort in knowing that salvation has already happened. We're already saved. The resurrection is already true. In his accounts of technology, Heidegger argued that the only way out is through, quoting Hölderlin, where the danger is that also grows the saving power. And in this sense, in Thomas's urge to see, we find both the dark heart of our current war on our own nature, and also the way that war on ourselves will fail, even if the technologists win out, as they already have, over those of us who urge caution. Because we will try and technologize away our own nature in an effort to see. We will fail, and in failing, we'll see what our nature always was, in its beauty and imperfection and createdness. And at that point, we will perhaps realize what Thomas realized, that he was already seeing. Like Thomas, we were always able to see. We just have to open our eyes. Perhaps when we get there, or even on the way to getting there, we'll learn to master our spirit of technicity and leave off making our nature a target for that engineering spirit, and instead aspire to ordering our technology, our ingenuity, to our created nature. Of course, even then, connecting that hope with the larger Christian picture still asks us for a leap of faith. But if there's one thing America has in abundance, it's faith. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'd like to open the room up for questions now.
Well, thank you very much. That was very stimulating. My name is Gary. I'm here at the theology department. I'm really intrigued and I'm drawn into the repeated use of Thomas and Jesus's manifestation of the risen Jesus and his manifestation of himself to Thomas. But what occurred to me is that you know, when Jesus, the risen Jesus, manifests himself, he's inviting Thomas to look upon his wounds. And we haven't talked about suffering, but that just seems to me like a huge question. I was wondering if you could comment on the idea that what Jesus is manifesting is that suffering is like an integral part of the path to our human salvation, in the way that technicity or just can't, not only can't deal with suffering, but is opposed to it.
I suppose the thing I'd say about that is that suffering is inevitably a byproduct of the spirit of technicity. Just yesterday, there were 2 cases reported in the United Kingdom of women trafficked for surrogacy. If that isn't an instance of suffering in the spirit of technicity, in service to the spirit of technicity, I don't know what is. Women who were forced to bear children to make money for somebody else, and the children who would then be taken away from their mothers and sold. If that isn't suffering in service to the spirit of technicity, I don't know what is. I could give countless other examples. We could be here all day. You know, once you lift the lid on the suffering that hides beneath the clinical surface, underneath the mask and the lab coat, it's endless.
Good afternoon, excuse me, and thank you for your lecture. My name is Samuel Seda. I'm a theology major, humanities major as well. My question has to do with, you were talking a lot about really sketching the roots of this technical impulse, this impulse to technologize everything from, shall we say, reproductivity to, I've heard of people who are trying to even technologically escape death, right? My question is, I suppose, a more, I don't want to say prognostical question, I suppose, and it's hypothetical, maybe a little bit more difficult to answer. But at one point, you said in your lecture that you fear that humans might learn the hard way the futility of these kinds of efforts. What do you think some of the consequences, what do you think some of the consequences of this will be in the near future? Clearly, you already have a culture defined by, say, artificial contraception and whatnot, but what do you think some of the more direct and worrisome consequences of this that we haven't seen already will be?
Oh, God. The instance that springs to mind that's probably the easiest to speculate about, because it's increasingly present in our public conversation, is probably the fertility crisis, which is, I mean, people blame it on all kinds of people point to a loss of faith or the breakdown of family or a lack of housing or any number of other things, but it's everywhere. It's literally the entire planet with one or two very, very minor outliers. The birth rate's crashing everywhere. And it's my assessment that this is very straightforwardly because technocapital is structurally antinatalist. It's hostile to that kind of generativity. It doesn't see that kind of generativity, and as such, it's structurally, because if it's structurally antinatalist, it's structurally anti-life, in the sense of our continued existence as a species. I mean, contraception, you could say, is part of that, but it's by no means the only part. You know, this is a systemic thing. This is an issue at the level of paradigm. And if I, as an instance of learning the hard way, I mean, it seems fairly clear to me that I have great faith in the human species in aggregate. We're going to make it. But whatever human subcultures survive the demographic pinch, which is coming, which is already here really, will be those ones that have developed a cultural or social immune system that's capable of resisting the anti-fertility, anti-natal forces, which are now just everywhere. And I suspect that will look nothing like the societies that we currently have. You know, in what ways it would be different, I don't know. But the only way we're going to get there is through the demographic pinch, which is going to come with some fairly painful side effects, I believe. So I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, we could be here all day speculating, but that would be one instance of learning of ways I think we're going to learn the hard way. And we'll come out the other side realizing that we do still need to reproduce in order to exist. And as such, you know, our human nature has not been abolished or gotten rid of. You know, we're still as fallen and flawed and present as ever.
Thank you so much for your lecture. One thing that seemed to really stick out to me in your lecture was the notion that people will eventually learn, we as a society, as a species, will eventually learn the error of these sort of faulty or half-baked or half-true conceptions of progress, but we have to really learn the hard way. Maybe this is just a personal thing, but like I like to intellectualize everything, and you know, one big thing that I've noticed is trying to like explain sort of the theoretical side to people. So what do you think is the best way to explain to people the meaning, or like when you have a society of people who are so closed off, whether they know it or not, on such a deep level and on such a habitual level to the traditional Christian worldview, what are some ways that you can maybe explain it to them in this sort of academic way or in terms of principles? Or do you think the only way for us as a species to learn our lesson is the hard way?
My dad, my late father, used to say, he was full of funny sayings, and one of his favorite remarks was that the quickest way to convince a fool of his folly is to leave him to it. You know, I have a horrible feeling that that's the answer. You know, there is no reasoning away a surfeit of reason. That's kind of, you know, you're not going to dismantle the master's tools using the master's house using the master's tools. We're not going to reason our way out of this. We have to open our eyes. And I suspect that you only get there the hard way.
Like if there's but I think a lot of this is going to mostly happen on an individual level. So what would your suggestions be for people who find themselves on that person-to-person level? Because I think and I am somewhat inclined to believe that on a social level, on a large-scale level, we're going to have to either deal with the consequences of our actions, or we need to have a mass conversion. So I think a lot of what's going to happen to make things better is on a person-to-person level. So what would you suggest for people who, you know, realize the truth of what you're saying and decide to, you know, start off on that grassroots level and to try to convince people on that level?
Do things differently. Get married, have kids. Live a good life. Don't be embarrassed about that. Tell other people what you're doing. Tell other people that it works.
Something that occurred to me listening to your lecture was that to some extent that sort of attitude towards technicity has been part of humanity from the beginning. I mean, we can think about clothes as a technology to cover up, you know, our shame and nakedness. And obviously that is I'm now defining technology very broadly, but I think part of your lecture begs the question for me, what is an appropriate sort of perspective towards technology for the people who are able to accept your message, sort of for Christians? Because I think obviously it seems pretty clear that there's certain attitudes towards technology and uses of technology that are clearly not healthy for society, but do you think there are any sort of attitudes we can have, or attitudes we can have towards technology that are actually beneficial?
Sure. Okay, two things. First, I strongly encourage you to have a look at Heidegger's essay on the question concerning technology, because in that he distinguishes between techne, as in technique, which he says has been with us since time immemorial, as you say, but which he distinguishes very clearly from the technological mindset, which he characterizes as in framing. I mean, it's kind of, his language is kind of weird, but it's very readable once you get the hang of it. I really encourage you to read it, because it's just an extraordinary kind of reality-altering piece of writing. So that's thing number one, for Heidegger's distinction between techne and technology. He does it much better than I would, so I'm not going to try and paraphrase him here. And thing number two, on more constructive relations to technology. I mean, I spoke a little bit at the end of my remarks just now about what I see as possibly a way forward in terms of ordering our technologies, you know, to human nature. If we can find a way to see or to intuit in that Gestalt sense of our humanness. Again, it ought not to be beyond the wit of man, to re-harness that spirit of ingenuity to a real understanding of what we are, rather than using it to wage war on that understanding. So, I mean, one very banal, one example that I could give of how this can work in practice. I know a great many women who don't want to use hormonal or other technological forms of contraception, but who use a fertility tracking app and various other interventions in order to become more aware and more conscious at a more granular level of their own reproductive cycles, such that they can manage their fertility using a technology, but in a way which is in harmony with their physiology rather than at war with it. And I think we could think of a great many other examples of an employment of technology in conjunction with the reality of who and what we are as human beings, that feel to me like a much healthier way forward, that's neither the reactionary desire to throw it all away, nor this kind of unhinged running at heaven on earth. I don't know. I hope it works.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I share the love of Heidegger's essay, The Question Concerning Technology. I had a couple of questions from your lecture. The first one was, you sort of out of the gate, you say, well, maybe we shouldn't be using this term progress, and I'm fully on board with the sort of connotations that a contemporary use of progress comes with, but it seems like you would still want to hold on to some notion of progress, but one that would be maybe more in line with a full recognition or full conscientiousness of our own limitations and of our own nature, and whatever moves us sort of in that direction would be considered progress. Whereas if we continue with this sort of spirit of technicity, we're actually declining in some way, or we kind of going in a movement of decline. The other question I had was, I've been reading recently a number of theoretical biologists who are really fascinating in a lot of ways, and I don't always know whether to cheer them on or to be very skeptical. But one of the figures who I'm reading, Michael Levin right now, he's working on developing forms of regenerative medicine for human beings. So, salamanders, if you cut their limb off, they somehow know to regrow a limb and know when to stop regrowing the limb, right? And, for some of these biologists and medical doctors, they want to kind of introduce this form of medicine into human beings so that if you lose a finger, you could regrow your finger, or if you have tissue that is missing in your heart, some form of cancer maybe has kind of eaten away at healthy tissue, to regrow that tissue. And I was wondering what your stance on this form of medicine would be, because in some ways it does not seem to want to go like for this ideal that would be surpassing human nature, but to find capacities within human nature for the healing of human nature itself, to bring it up to the level sort of that health would consist in. Does that make sense?
It does. In answer to your first question, yes, that sounds great. Two points in response to your second one, if I can keep them clear in my mind. The first point, my first thought when you talk about technologies to regrow human tissue is we might say that if this is ordered to restoring normal human health, then perhaps this is okay. I don't know, but I think it would be extraordinarily difficult, scientists being who they are, to stop there. I mean, if you think about what happens, if you think about how quickly plastic surgery overshoots the pursuit of ideal beauty and becomes Instagram face, you can see how quickly that happens. I think the urge to regrow not just fingers but I don't know, tentacles or something would be totally irresistible. And the second point on regrowing human tissue is that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I mean, in a sense, it doesn't matter what I think, because if somebody's going to do it, they're going to do it, and it's not like they're going to listen to me. But if we do that, and it turns out, and it works, great, that we can have a conversation about it then. But I think it's just as plausible that it will turn out to have all sorts of alarming side effects, which, if you stay within the technological paradigm, then become themselves targets for a tech fix. But which, if it does turn out actually just to create the stuff of nightmares, I don't know, your fingers carry on growing and they never stop, or something. I don't know. I mean, we're in sci-fi territory here. But at that point, once again, we've left the ordering to normal and to a normative picture of our nature, and we've arrived again somewhere else. And I think if we did that enough times, we'd have learned the hard way why you shouldn't do that.
Thank you very much, Father Dominic in the Theology Department. My question concerns these maybe subcultures that give you some hope, of outlasting the antinatalist demographic winter that we're approaching. Are there any practices, cultural, religious practices, perhaps ascetical practices, but features of a kind of counterculture that that provide a counter witness to this immanentization of the eschaton, that kind of point to the eschaton as being not yet, that would be valuable to instantiate in our own lives and in our community?
So are you asking me to share any groups or communities who are living more in life as it is, rather than in relation to a desire to realize heaven on earth?
I'm sorry. Maybe I should be more specific. I guess what I'm looking for, what I've heard from your talk is that there's this great concern for this technicity, and so there's kind of a negative thrust to your talk. We need to look at technology differently. We need to not do this. Doing this is immanentizing the eschaton in a aberrant form of the Christian narrative. So I guess I'm looking at what aspects of maybe traditional Christian practice, or would be especially important in this age as a counter witness to this immanentization.
Honestly, the thing that springs most immediately to mind on that is just showing up, whether that's in church or for your family, showing up in the real world. My relationship to Christianity is complicated. But I go to church regularly, even when I'm not sure, and I do that because showing up there's something about showing up that brings a kind of gift, which you just don't get from reading or thinking or theorizing, and is not the same as having a moment of revelation or Damascene conversion. It's not that. There's something about the repetition of it. There's something about the pattern which I think has a lesson for anyone who's pursuing the exceptional, who's trying to understand things by dismantling them, which is really what the technological impulse is about. That we can cut everything into little pieces and put it back together differently if we want to, because then we'll have understood it. And there's, you show up with the same community of people week after week, and things just happen. Relationships develop, or you find yourself surprisingly, like my husband is now in a band. That just happened somehow as a consequence of showing up. It sounds ridiculous, but actually it's lovely, and that's just a tiny example. And I think if there's something there in the practice which is fundamentally valuable, is as an antidote, as a mode of resistance to the spirit of technicity, it really is showing up in real life. Showing up with others in real life.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed your reflections at the beginning on sort of the common spirit and intellectual and political heritage of Britain and the United States. And my question is, to what extent is this idea of progress and this spirit of technicity baked in an inseparable way, at a constitutional level to our societies? And is there a such thing as a rejection of or resistance to technicity that comports with and is compatible with rather than just being a resistance to or a rejection of, like, those Whiggish tendencies that, you know, kind of gave birth to our Constitution. You know, is technicity, you know, nearly synonymous with, you know, liberalism as we conceive of it, or you know, is there a more humanistic way to be, to do, to govern, to, you know, relate, that wouldn't be a rejection of those premises?
Oh gosh, I mean, I'm probably not the best qualified person to opine on the American Constitution, you know, not least being a foreigner. I mean, there's definitely a school of thought that says America as such is a liberal project. You know, as you know, the Constitution, you know, the whole American Revolution is just so structurally liberal. I mean, I don't know where I stand on all of this. I feel like I'm not well enough informed to take a view on that. But I suppose what I would say is you guys have been here for some time now, you know, and things have moved on a lot. You know, and the idea that because this happened then, nothing is ever going to change or develop or evolve. You know, I mean, you know, this place has a history of its own. You know, it's a complicated history, and I know that there's a lot of grappling going on with that history. You know, in the present moment. But I think that ought to be enough in its own right. You know, to serve as a sort of cumulated repository of meaning without having to just refer back always to the original document. Does that answer your question?
Sure. Yeah.
Or some of it, anyway.
Yeah. It does. And yeah, it's a, you know, very broad question. So yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah. Thank you.
Hello, I have nothing to do with Providence College, and I'm in a completely different field, so this is a new territory of language, and I really appreciate, well, your writing and you being here, and understand so clearly how we've made our human nature the target of technicity. But I wondering how there's another consequence, obviously, to our embrace of technology, which involves the rest of the world besides humans. And you proposed, you know, there's things that work, you know, have the family, you know, show up. But I'm wondering whether the technology is needed to both change this delusion of progress that we've kind of spread about the world and the consequences that it has brought about. You know, I'm thinking of things like Paul Stamets and his being able to clean up an oil spill using fungi, and you know how desperately needed there are solutions that might not just come about by our, you know, taking care of ourselves and going to church and having a family. So that's what I'm asking you.
Yeah, I suppose yes. I mean, I sort of had to limit my remarks to a certain amount of time. You know, I only touched very briefly on the ecological dimension to this dilemma, this moment, if you like. But I mean, you can do another cut at this same question, which really speaks to the whole created world rather than the whole created nature, not just our created nature. And I think there's, you know, in much the same way as I talked about, you know, trying to find ways of ordering our technology to our nature, which is really, I suppose, at an abstract level, it's what the gentleman in the back was describing when he talked about, you know, a vision of progress which brings us closer to, you know, some understanding of our human nature. You know, in ecological terms, yes, perhaps there's a version of that which does, for, you know, as you described, for example, clean up oil spills, or find plastic-eating bacteria which can help us to get rid of the mountains of garbage that we leave everywhere. You know, perhaps there are ways that we can make better some of the things that we've broken by looking for ways to reorder our technologies to the rest of created nature as well as to our own. I sincerely hope so. I feel like that would be a way forward I would love to see in the world.
Hello. Sorry. I'm Matt DeFusco. I'm a political science major here at Providence College. So I'm gonna ask you to elaborate on it a little bit. So you mentioned failure as part of human progression and realization. Alongside this, you mentioned a strong Christian faith among American citizens, which is a strong driving force in human progression. So, alluding to my question, in American politics being defined as utopian and adhering to technology, will failure be necessary for political advancement? What might this look like, and how does this tie into American Christian faith?
To the first question, will failure be part of the American project? Probably yes, because we're all going to have to learn the hard way. What could that look like? I suppose it's difficult to. You have to. That sort of depends on what scale you're looking at. I'm hesitant to speculate because this is a. I mean, we're in an election year. It's all getting a bit antsy. But I think. How can I answer this without getting in trouble? I think I can't. We'll chat later. And how do we tie that to a resurgence of American Christian faith? I mean, just to clarify, when I speak about raw reserves of spiritual wealth in this country, some of that is ordered to a Christian, to the Christian framework. Some of it is not. Some of it is ordered to a sort of white-labeled version of the Christian framework, which is a lot of what powers the progress theology that I've been characterizing here. Some of it's very confused and just kind of floats around looking for things to believe in. Is it possible to re-Christianize America in a formal political sense? Honestly, I mean, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this as well, but I think political Christianity at scale is probably toast. At least, so maybe that's just my British pessimism, but it's certainly toast in my country. Whether I don't think there's an integralist America on the horizon. I'd be surprised, sincerely, if that was ever realistically going to happen. Is faith going to survive and re-emerge and flourish in America? Yeah, I think so. What form that takes, though, I think is up to you guys.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kathleen. I'm a theology professor. I want to start by saying I think you have really understood Americans. I felt very understood, slightly indicted, but in a good way, in a very good way. So I affirm that, appreciate that. So my question has to do with the criteria you brought up for evaluating if we're using technology well. And you said if it's working against human nature, if we're antagonistic to our own natures, that this is a sign it's gone wrong. And that if it's working sort of with our human nature, that this is a sign that it could be productive and good, which I agree with. And my question has to do with two examples you used, the pill and then doping in sports. Because when I think through those two, I actually feel that doping in sports may fall under the category of working with our nature, at least my understanding of common forms of doping, that this isn't necessarily against human nature in the same way that the pill is. So I'm curious to know what you think about that, because doping can be very extreme, as you mentioned, but it seems to differ in kind from the pill.
You might be right. I guess I'm sincerely interested to see what happens with the enhanced games, in a slightly morbid way, but I'm sincerely fascinated to see what they do, and what actually comes from that, whether. Yeah, because it's plausible. It's plausible that this will represent, as you say, a way of using technology which is aligned with what humans, the outer limits, but still recognizably human limits of what we're capable of. I mean, again, as with plastic surgery and regenerative limbs, and here I'm doing the tentacle thing again. It's plausible to imagine that we would find ourselves, via the technological impulse, very swiftly escaping those limits, and trying and finding ourselves, creating athletes which just don't look or feel or present like people at all. But yeah, I think it's not up to me. I'm going to be very interested and morbidly interested to see what they do.
One more question, and then we'll enjoy our reception together.
I'm the final question. Okay. Thanks so much for your talk. I had a quick question, kind of going back in response to the statement you made about kind of a national Christian political project kind of no longer being in the future. And along those lines of, what are the mores then? Like, what is holding us society? Is it a vague sense of natural law? What's just preventing the country from going into moral ruin and complete disintegration? What is holding us together, and what is it hatred? Is it division? Those certainly seem to be parts of it, but is there something positive, some moral, vague sense of being a good person? Is that it? Like, that doesn't seem like it can be it. So I just would be wondering what your thoughts are on kind of what are the mores holding society together then?
Some of it is literally technology. I mean, that's Wang Huning's take on what keeps everything more or less functioning, kind of, sort of. The roads and the cars and the payment systems and the various technological and technocratic systems, which enable everybody to be as free and as unobliged to one another as maximally unmoored. That's the Wang Huning answer to your question. Actually, what's holding you together is technology, and not just him. Actually, I wish I could remember the origin of this quote, but I remember reading a theorist of architecture, of all things, about 20 years ago, who observed, not just about America, but about modernity in general, that the singularity of a pluralistic world is technology. That's if you like, the transcendental signifier, in a way that perhaps in previous ages God used to be. That in our age, technology is the transcendental signifier. But I don't think it's just that. I really don't. There are a lot of people here who obviously have more holding them together than just technology. I mean, I walk into this building and I look at the books on the shelves and the pictures on the walls and the magazines on the racks, and we're having this conversation now. There's so much more, and there are so many other instances of something as cohesive in its pluralistic way as that. And this place, my sense of America is that it's always been, to an extent, a patchwork in that respect, and that's part of what's made it so resilient. And it's my hope that will continue to be true, because there's something beautiful about a flourishing pluralism in that sense, which has always been part of the vision for this country. And I think you could still have that. It doesn't just have to be a giant country of atoms held together by the internet.
Friends, please join me in thanking Mary Harrington.